Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for our webinar. We're going to address the topic of Equifax, what went wrong, and how to prevent it from happening to you. Before we begin, I think we want to be very clear that this is really not about pointing the finger at Equifax or blaming them in any way. But these types of breaches are becoming increasingly routine in corporate America. They're making the headlines at a rapid rate. And what we want to do is take a look at what did in fact happen and what the lessons learned are from that and how we can help position you and your organization to protect yourselves going forward. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Julian Smith and Buffy Ellis from the Academy Division of Focal Point. They've got tremendous experience in this space, and they're going to be leading the way for us today on our webinar. Before we get into that, I would like to introduce Tech 2000, who is our partner in this. We've signed up with Tech 2000 and have been working with them to address the enterprise market for a little while now. They've been doing this for over 25 years. They're among the leaders in the training space, and they've got a fantastic set of credentials. When you take a look at their customer satisfaction scores, you understand why they enjoy the position that they do in the industry. Unfortunately, Kirsty is not able to join us today, and standing in for her is Cynthia Porter. So, Cynthia, I'll turn it over to you to share a few words with us.
Oh, there we go. Thanks, Chris. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Just a quick introduction, Tech 2000, before we get into the juice of this webinar. So we are your next generation learning partner. We specialize in instructor-led training, digital learning, content development, along with a lot of learning analytics in our tools. We have been awarded several innovation awards over the past several years, one being Cisco's Innovative Partner of the Year for 5 years running, which is fabulous. We are thrilled to have partnered with Focal Point and happy to co-host this webinar. Focal Point they are the leaders in the security industry and have some of the top SMEs when it comes to cybersecurity. They give you access to a level of training that's you just can't find anywhere else. So without further ado, I'll turn it back over to the team, and hope you guys enjoy this webinar with us.
Fantastic. Thanks, Cynthia. So as we get into the breach, there's a number of statistics that some of you may be familiar with. And I think what's interesting about this is how this is really reflective of not just what's happened to Equifax, but what's happening everywhere. And one of the main themes I think you'll recognize through what we saw within Equifax and what we're seeing increasingly with other breaches, some of which aren't actually even making the news, is that the goal really here is not to build a network or an IT system that is not capable of being breached. Right? That's really not even actually possible. The goal here is to understand when you do get breached, who's breached and what the potential damage is and how to address it. And so having said that, I'm going to turn this over to Julian, and he'll show more about his understanding of this.
Sure, thanks, Chris. So yeah, I'm Focal Point Academy's Director of Education. I have a bit of a background, well, a fairly extensive background, I guess, in network security and operating system security, and was an instructor for a good while as well in those fields. And yeah, now serving as the Academy's Director of Education. This breach, as Chris said, is not. It certainly doesn't stand alone, right? It is not unique. In its general picture. It's unique, obviously, in the specific technical details, but we've sort of become accustomed to these kind of statistics that you're looking at here. And I want to be clear here and just careful to separate the nature of the breach itself from the consequence of the breach. I think the thing that has brought Equifax right to the fore in all of this is certainly not how advanced the breach was, but it's the fact that Equifax holds data, sensitive financial data on basically every adult in North America, or certainly in the United States, and in some other countries. And whether we choose to or not, our data is in their databases, right? They're sort of part of the fabric of the financial landscape. So everyone essentially is affected by this. And of course, as you can see there in the right-hand column, there are already a number of class action lawsuits that have been initiated against Equifax. There's going to be some serious financial fallout for them in due course, and the senior leadership of all. Well, they haven't actually. Some of them retired early. the CIO and CSO took early retirement in the wake of this. Breach. So we're probably all familiar with what happened, but just as a very quick recap, there was and we'll get into a little bit more detail in this as we go along. But there was a breach in a web application that was being used by Equifax that allowed attackers to get an initial foothold into their networks. And then the unfortunate thing is that they were allowed space and time to find their way around networks and systems, and ultimately find their way to large amounts of consumer data, large enough amounts that data needed to be chunked up to be shipped out of the network, so as not to sort of trip alarms and detection systems and things like that. So you'll see there on the left that hackers spent 4 months possibly in the networks before being discovered. That's still actually kind of up for debate. There was certainly some kind of suspicious activity back in March. We'll come to a timeline in a minute. And certainly confirmed activity from May, and then the breach discovered at the end of July. That is not unusual. It's actually it's unfortunately quite common for attackers to spend more than 100 days in an organization's networks before they are discovered, and we'll see a little bit more about that as we go along. So what had Equifax actually done? Right? What had they done right leading up to this? Well, they had invested in security. They had a fairly extensive plan of investing in security platforms. They had a high-end intrusion prevention system in place. They had built up a security operations center. So they'd done a bunch of the right things, got themselves in a good position platform-wise. And one of the tools actually that we'll probably come back to a little bit later on as well was a sort of we think of it as a black box for network data, a tool called Moloch, which is actually what's allowed them and Mandiant, whom they hired to investigate, to reconstruct what happened in this breach from start to finish. So that Moloch system basically sucks in copies of all of the internal network data and archives a copy of it. They're able to search through that and actually pinpoint specific points of access and specific commands that were used by the attackers and all the rest of it. So they had a good platform in place.
Hey, Julian, I'd like to add something there.
Yeah.
I know at this point everyone's looking at and to a certain degree criticizing Equifax's lack of security, lack of patching and known vulnerability. But one of the things I would like to call out there is they did actually detect the breach themselves. And that might not seem significant, but many organizations that have been breached, it's only when the breach data shows up for sale on the dark web, or a security researcher finds that information out on the internet and brings it to the attention of the organization. One of the write-ups that I read discussed how Equifax's team did detect and block some suspicious traffic. So somewhere along the line, and I know you're going to go into the timeline here in a minute, but one of the many things that these attackers did in fact trigger some kind of response on the part of Equifax. So I would like to give them credit for that.
Yeah, absolutely, and we'll see as we go along here. And Chris painted this picture right from the outset that if you read the articles that are circulating about this breach, it's very easy for everyone to point the finger and say, "Oh, how could they possibly be this slack in their security?" And look at the sensitivity of the data that they've exposed. But to be fair to Equifax, this could have happened to anyone. Yes, there were some mistakes along the way. We'll look at those. But I think if we were honestly looking at our own organizations and trying to tell ourselves, no, that couldn't possibly happen in my organization, I think we'd struggle. So let's go to that timeline.
Actually, Julian, before we do, to that end, Equifax clearly made some investment here, right? They spent money on platforms, they spent money on employees, they built a SOC, they deployed a system. How does this compare to what a lot of companies in corporate America are doing? In your opinion, is this underinvestment? Is this actually above average for investment, and it was the execution that was at fault here?
Well, that's a little bit of an unanswerable question, because I don't have all the details of exactly how much investment they made. Certainly, they seem to have put the right tools and platforms in place. Another thing that we'll come to shortly here as well, we're jumping ahead ourselves a lot, but that's okay. They had a security chief, Tony Spinelli, who was well renowned in the security industry, who left the company in 2013 or 2012, I believe it was, end of 2012, and then his deputy soon after that in early 2013, and then a lot of the team that they had built as well. So that is definitely a contributing factor to this problem. I don't think it doesn't seem, from what I understand of the situation so far, it does not seem that they had underinvested at all in security. It's just, it really comes down to how you're using what you've got and how much you're enforcing the policy that you've established. Certainly in the time when Tony Spinelli was still leading that operation, they were doing things like incident preparation drills and emergency response drills, right? What do we do if we discover a breach? What's the plan? That's a crucial step for any organization, and I know that was happening. I don't know for a fact that it had stopped, but it sort of appears to have done, just based on the outputs that we've seen come out here. So here's the timeline of what we know so far. So the vulnerability that was initially exploited here was it was made public on March 6th by Apache, and we'll come to some more details on it in a minute. So I'm going to resist the temptation to dive into that right now, because that's obviously stuff I'm very interested in. And there was some, as this notes, interaction with that vulnerability back in March. As I mentioned a while ago, Mandiant were called in to investigate this breach, and they're tying this together. They've issued a report to Equifax, and they know that that activity from mid-May is certainly a direct result or a direct forerunner to the breach that occurred and the the pillaging of all that data. And it's possible that actually that initial activity back in March was the beginning of all of this. Whether those were the same actors or not carrying out those actions, there's still a problem here that there was no response to either of those immediately, and we'll come back to what that should have been or what it could have looked like in this particular case in a bit. But we certainly know that by mid-May, there was evidence in their systems that they'd been breached, and attackers were moving around in their networks. One of the first things that the attackers did in May, after exploiting this vulnerability, is to install a number of what are called web shells, which is basically like a hidden web page that you put on somebody's server that it's there as the attacker. No one else knows it's there, and it just allows you a sort of a backdoor into the server anytime you want to. So even if the vulnerability is patched at some point, you've created your secret entrance, your secret backdoor into the network. And obviously part of the cleanup from this involved going around and identifying all of those web shells, and then securing the applications or the web servers on which they sat. And then, so you've got then the period from mid-May through to July 29th, which is when the incident happened that Buffy mentioned a couple of moments ago. Buffy, do you just want to recount for us what that was, July 29th?
Sorry, I was on mute. So Equifax themselves released a statement, and what they said was that their security team investigated and blocked suspicious traffic that it identified on the online dispute portal. And I want to bring that up and draw your attention to that, because there's something I want to talk about a little bit later. So what we're talking about, the online dispute portal, that's specifically where you, as an owner of your personal information, if you find things on your credit report that you don't believe are accurate, you can submit a dispute. Some of the credit reporting agencies, you do that in writing via a letter. Some have put online portals where you will, in order to prove that it's you, have to input your personal information. So your social security, your birthday, your address, your full name, and some of those lovely knowledge-based questions that are really just checks against publicly available information about you.
What was the name of your first pet and first
right.
car? Everything that's on Facebook, basically.
Right. Yeah, yep. Pretty much. Anything that your mom willingly posts, even if you don't. And then it goes a step further. It says then the firm identified or discovered additional suspicious activity the next day. So it took down the web application, patched it, and then brought it back online. That's the official statement. And Julian and I were actually touching on this earlier in a conversation that it is, as grave as this attack is, what that tells us is somewhere along the line, they either had an active analyst looking at traffic and identifying that as suspicious, or they had appropriately written IDS signatures that identified that traffic as suspicious. And looking at the chain of events here, my suspicion would be it's access to one of those shells that were left behind and the shell code itself that triggered some kind of alert. And I'd even go a step further. We all know that the data had already been exfiltrated. That's what we've learned now. So my suspicion would be that it was not the data exfiltration, but the shell code or some of the persistent aspects of what they put in place.
Yeah, that's something that it wasn't included in the released version of the Mandiant report and probably never will be. but to confirm or deny that, it certainly seems like a case. But we'll have to see if we can sneak out some inside data on that. Okay, so yeah, so what has happened next? So yeah, Mandiant were brought in to investigate. It took until September 7th for the breach to be announced publicly. There is a bit of I'm obviously going to dance very carefully around this next point, but I will just deliver the facts for now that 3 senior executives sold almost $2 million worth of stock 2 or 3 days after the company knew about the breach, so August 1st and August 2nd, and obviously the breach wasn't made public until September 7th. As you can imagine, there are investigations starting into whether they knew more than they have let on. The company has issued a statement saying that they weren't aware of the breach at that point. So we'll let that one play itself out. I'm not about to start making accusations that will wind me up in court. And then, unfortunately, this was, I think, the first major mistake interfacing with the public in the response, which was that they'd set up a separate website, equifaxsecurity2017.com, and directed consumers to that website to check whether their information may have been compromised in this breach. Now, before we go any further with that, that should be just a no-no. Right, if you just think about the situation here, you've got a company that's entrusted with sensitive financial data, and in response to acknowledging a large-scale breach of that data, they're saying, well, come to this other website that we've set up and put in some personal data for us to find out whether or not you may have been compromised. And then, if you like, you can register for a year's free credit monitoring. And actually, that the terms and conditions on registering for that credit monitoring included waiving your right to, being involved in class action lawsuits and, submitting to arbitration in a way that would obviously be a lot more controlled by Equifax. So not a great PR move. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say there goes 10 years of user awareness training down the drain, right?
Yeah.
We're constantly, hopefully, training users to be savvy about the links that they follow and the sites that they visit. And as an end user as well, there's not a chance that I would go to a website that isn't the exact name of the entity that I'm trying to visit.
Yep. Yeah, and then what unfortunately made this a whole lot worse is that a security researcher named Nick Sweeting set up a clone of this website just simply to prove how easy it would be to copy the website and phish people and steal their information by sending out. So he just switched the words and he registered the domain security equifax2017.com instead of equifaxsecurity2017.com. Cloned the website using easily available tools, and for whatever reason, I don't know how this came about, but the official Twitter account of Equifax tweeted out that false domain 4 times to consumers to say, here, come here and put in your details. So that website had something like 200,000 hits before it was taken taken down or the problem was corrected. And of course, this researcher is not interested in stealing anyone's information, but the website was asking for, you know, the last 6 of your social and date of birth and your full name and your address. So that just goes to show you how bad an idea it is to set up an alternate domain like that, because someone else can set up an alternate domain, and all of a sudden you've got a big, you know, phishing scam on your hands as well, and you've compounded the problem.
Sure, and I'd like to, if you don't mind, add to that. When we talked about earlier, Julian and I, the methodology, how they gained access, obviously at that stage when they put up the second website for consumers to go in and check to see if their information had been verified, they hadn't finished their investigation. So it wasn't necessarily entirely clear where the vulnerabilities lied and how the attackers gained access. And theoretically, then you have consumers going to a secondary website, again using a web app, right, and using an API to access a database that's been breached. And you know, I don't know about you, Julian, but that whole thing makes me uncomfortable.
Yes, it does. Yeah, it does seem like something you would not want to do as a consumer. You would not. It's not worth the you know, the potential of finding out whether, I mean, really at this point you have to just assume that every working adult in the US has had that information compromised, right? That's really the assumption we have to make. It may not be everyone, but it's almost up to that level. So instead of checking, well, could this have possibly been me, I think the consumer reaction needs to just assume, yeah, I'm sure it was me, and then taking, you know, that's a whole other conversation, is what personal steps can we take now to protect ourselves in light of this breach. We might get time to touch on that in a bit, but certainly in terms of the corporate response, obviously having a response which was based on their central main web domain would have been crucial, right? That's absolutely what should have happened, so that users knew they were coming to the right site and not just off to something else.
Sure, exactly.
So this is what you see here in the post-mortem slide is part one, at least, is something that we covered earlier. So there had been a very strong security culture, but you know, we know as much as the head and deputy of security left the company, and apparently a lot of the team that they had built followed them out of the door. The people who were appointed in their place, who have also since left the company in light of this situation, were not as well proven in the industry, and it's easy to see that maybe that, you know, standards had lapsed in that time. It would be very easy just to kind of point the finger around and say, yeah, they just got slack about security, and certainly there's evidence of that, and we'll come to in a second as we come to the details of this vulnerability. We'll see that, but also you may have, if you've read any articles about this, you will have probably read about the breach of another database in Argentina that's owned by Equifax, that is also a dispute resolution website, or supporting a dispute resolution website, where the default credentials, the administrative credentials to this database, had not been changed from the default username admin and password admin, and on a publicly facing server, and so separately to all of this, you've got the problem of other information being, you know, leaked from servers down there. Probably not affecting US persons in that case, but it's easy to look at those things and say, well, clearly there were falling standards. I mean, clearly it's true in that case that there should have been a rigorous password policy in place, and it should have been enforced as well. And one or other of those things, or both of them, didn't happen.
Julian, do you mind if I expand on that?
Do.
So one of the things I found interesting in reading a little bit more about the Argentina breach, which, you know, anytime someone gains unauthorized access, even if it's because you forgot to change the default username and password, you know, that is a breach, right? In this case, what that person or persons was able to access in the Argentinian web server is indicative of what they could have found in the US. In fact, one of the things I was considering this morning is that's an excellent place to do reconnaissance to find out how the security of the web servers of Equifax are structured, what the usernames look like, because what they were able to gain from that Argentinian server is employees of Equifax's information to include their email addresses, and that gives you structure indicators. You get a feel for what standards and processes the company uses for setting up accounts, which again just gives you intel that you could then apply in the US breach, right? And then of course it also included people's PII, actual consumers' PII. So to me, I considered that to be one possible area of reconnaissance prior to the chain of events we detailed earlier.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, and of course, I mean, just the amount of PII that would have come out of that hall as well is a gold mine for social engineering. Or, you know, imagine if somebody calls you and said they're calling from Equifax about your dispute resolution, and here's the case ID, or can you confirm the case ID for me before we proceed? You know, they kind of flip that trust model and say, I'm calling from Equifax and I need to know that I can trust you and you're really the person you're supposed to be, and ask you to confirm some data, and they know all about the case, and then they ask you for further details. Then, you know, that's if you've got the manpower, that's a gold mine for recovering further, you know, bank details, whatever financial details about consumers, and then obviously exploiting that. So, yeah, not a happy situation. So looking at the things that could have stopped the breach, so what you see on the left here, better security standards, a lot of that applies to what we've just been talking about. Also, part of the main breach in the US involved finding credentials on computer systems within the network, and then being able to use those credentials to access databases that otherwise were well protected. So, you know, there's just another sort of classic policy misstep or lack of policy enforcement. That password management is absolutely crucial and should be handled securely, and you should never have, you know, just plain text files of passwords on your computer system. I know a lot of people do it. A lot of people reuse passwords across systems because they have so many to remember, and that creates such potential for a breach, an initial breach, becoming so much worse. I mean, this sort of echoes of the Target breach of 2014, when the attackers in that case were unable. They were trying to get into the databases of customer information of Target, but those databases were actually too well protected, and that's why they ended up going after the point of sale machines, because there was one point in the chain where a credit card had been swiped on a point of sale machine, and that data had not yet been encrypted, right? It had just been read off the card, and so they developed malware to grab that information before it was then encrypted and sent in encrypted form to databases which were well protected. Similar thing here. If you give up credentials to things that, you know, within the network, then you just allow people to bypass all of that security. So that's, you know, that's a bit of a huge one. And in particular, so the interesting thing about this, the initial breach that caused this compromise of data, is that it's a very trivial vulnerability to exploit, but it's actually not trivial to patch. And I'm going to try, I'm not quite sure of my audience here, I'm going to try not to geek out on you too much, but just to give you an idea of sort of how simple this would have been. So the vulnerability was in a library, a code library that's called Apache struts. And code libraries are basically groups of functions that, instead of having to write all of the code yourself from scratch, you can call a function that does something for you that's in a library that's already been built. And so when developers build these web applications, they'll include that library, and then they do what's called compiling their application. So they take just the code that they've written, the sort of readable source code, they compile it into something that can run on the machine. And the vulnerability was in this struts library, and in particular in how it did error handling. And so in the HTTP traffic that was flowing to and from this web server, you've got, when you use HTTP in general, right, when you're browsing the web, your web browser, which is known as a client in this sort of situation, will send requests, client requests, to the web server, and the web server will respond with hopefully blobs of data like your web page or your image, whatever it is you ask for, and then a response header as well. And those that request and response, those packets contain certain fields that have certain structures. So the request obviously contains things like what's the name of the thing I'm asking for, what's the name of the server that it's on, what languages do I speak, and data like that. And the responses will contain also these fields of metadata, things like, okay, well, this is the name of the thing you wanted. Here's a response code saying, okay, you got what you wanted, or you got an updated version or something like that. Here's something about, if it's, say, it's been compressed or encoded in some way as it's sent back to you, here's the compression or encoding that's been used so that your browser can undo that. And then also a thing called content type. What kind of content is this actually that we're giving you? And it's a vulnerability in the library to do with how the library handles problems in that content type field. There is a fixed list of things that should be in there. It's a long list, but it's a centrally managed list. It's owned by IANA, which is the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, which is part of the IETF. There's part of the sort of the the organizations that basically help manage, they don't own the internet, but they help to manage it and manage standards and things. So there's a list of what all of those content types can be, what all the possible options are. And it turns out that you can just add a command string into that content type field, and the library says, oh, well, that's not in my list. This is an error. This is something that's wrong. But it doesn't process that error correctly, and it ends up just executing the command that you sent it. So you don't have to be a programmer to be able to do this. You don't have to be, the guy with the hoodie in his basement, or the black hat aficionado. It's a very simple thing to just construct one of these headers and type in the text that says, I want it to execute this command, and then send that to the server. And so it's very simple to exploit. The flip side of that is that it's not just a case of applying a patch like you would do, maybe on your home computer system. You get a thing from Microsoft or from Adobe or from wherever saying you need to update this, and this patch fixes security issues, and you click install patch and it's done, and you've updated your application. In this case, what you have to do to resolve the problem is you have to recompile the web application. You have to go back to the source code. You have to recompile the application using the updated version of the library that then has that vulnerability removed. And that's a much bigger thing to do. And actually, the Equifax team tried to do this, and they hit problems. So they knew that this was a vulnerability that affected them. They attempted to update their web apps, but if you think about it for a minute, that it could easily be that you don't have any support anymore for those web apps. If they were developed by a developer team that's now working on something else, it's not as simple as the administrators just trying to apply a patch. They have to go out to another team. It could even be another company. A third-party company may have developed the web app for them, right? So it's not trivial to fix a problem like that. So if you read articles about this, you'll see about, oh, how could they have let such a trivial exploit be used against them? Well, it's a weird situation in that it's a very easy thing to exploit, and it's actually quite a bit harder to fix. Now, what I want to focus on that we'll see coming up here, actually let's flip to the next slide, is that accepting that risk is not the same as just ignoring it. Right, and this is one of the things that we touch on in our training. You've got the classic accept, transfer, mitigate model of risk management. And when you accept a risk like that, when you say, well, we've tried to fix this, but we can't, we'll just have to live with it. If that's a decision that you make as an organization, you need to have a way to monitor that situation and see, okay, did this actually become a problem? And that's the big piece that was missing here on Equifax's part. So they've got a known vulnerability. If you're into these things, you want to go read the CVE listing that tells you about the actual technical details of this vulnerability. You'll see that it has already been, as of March, it was already exploited in the wild. In other words, it's been observed in use on the internet. People are exploiting this vulnerability. They knew that it affected them. They tried to update the server and they'd failed. Well, then the first thing, if they were going to leave that server up and running, and still accessible, the first thing that needed to happen was for the patch management team to go to the monitoring team in the Security Operations Center and say, we have this vulnerability, we have this hole in our security, and we need hawk eyes on it to know whether it's been exploited. And that apparently didn't happen because it took 141 days for them to detect the breach. How
Julian,
could? Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I was just thinking about how many organizations I've actually seen that have a process for what you just said, where the patch team interfaces with the SOC, and in particular, the folks writing signatures, right? You and I have both encountered organizations that do that, but to me, in my experience as a pen tester, as doing vulnerability assessments over a number of years, very few organizations actually have a defined process for taking things like unpatched vulnerabilities and making sure they become signatures.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and even in a lot of cases, you have an IT department and a security department, right? And the security department is doing monitoring. They don't have the ability to actually update the infrastructure necessarily, right? They can update the IDS, the intrusion detection system, but they can't, so the patch management might be done in the IT department, but someone has to go to another department to say this needs monitoring, and that disconnect definitely happens a lot.
Well, and I've seen, to take it a step further, when you have, an attempt to mitigate by applying the patch or attempting to apply the patch, and that fails, oftentimes now, if you want to take a web app offline or switch over to a failover while you're repairing one, that involves like a change control board. Sometimes you have to, you might submit something in writing. It might take months for that board to come back with an approval for you to do the work to actually mitigate. And the key piece here is the communications piece, where if that indeed was the internal process, which we don't know, that in the meantime, the SOC should definitely been alerted and, hey, we have this unpatched vulnerability, we know about it, it's set to be repaired in our next cycle when we can take this thing offline.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And this is starting to bring us around to the traffic analysis course that I know Chris is going to share about in a moment. So what easily could have happened here is the Security Operations Center could have been monitoring traffic to that server and analyzing it for signs of a breach. Just as it's trivial to exploit this vulnerability, you just insert this command string in the right place in one of these header fields, and your command gets executed on the server. Well, it's also very simple to write a filter in a traffic analysis tool, something like Wireshark, where you're analyzing network traffic, where you can filter for, I want to see if there are any packets of network data on my network that contain this. That's very easy to do, and in fact, the traffic analysis course we're going to talk about in a minute, you would learn the syntax for that on the very first day of the course. Now, I'm not trying to say that if you come to one day of training, you could have stopped this breach, because actually the goal of the training is much more about how you apply knowledge and understanding, and then you use the syntax to enact that. But it would have saved Equifax the extent of this breach if they had known right up front that the breach had occurred, if it hadn't taken so long. Now, as Buffy mentioned, they did discover for themselves, so good on them for that. But either some traffic analysis or configuring an intrusion detection system appropriately could have alerted them, immediately to, hey, somebody just breached our web server and we need to respond. So, right,
and we do know they were capturing the traffic, as you mentioned earlier. They had a box. They had all the packets. They just didn't put the whole thing together until obviously.
And that's a great thing to have. That's not a simple investment, because corporate networks generate an awful lot of network traffic, so that requires some serious storage. But you can see in this case that it's actually allowed them. I mean, if you get access to the report, you'll see that the Mandiant investigators were able to recreate not only the initial point of access, but also what were the exact commands they started issuing as they landed in the network, because that's all been captured in that system. So that's actually a really crucial piece to this whole thing. You can only analyze what you have, right?
Every time, I can't express how much fun that is. I mean, it's not fun when you've been breached, but it's really fun to go back and reconstruct a chain of events. It's plain detective, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. So, one of the things that I think we've seen as a recurring theme through not only a look into what happened with Equifax, but what's happened with just about every one of these is that it's really not about having the tools within the organization. It's not about the technology investment. It's about having a plan, and it's about having people who have the skills to do the right things with those tools to help protect their company. And really, that's at the crux of the value proposition for the courses that we offer. We will take just a few seconds here to plug an open enrollment class that we're offering in conjunction with Tech 2000. The class is scheduled to be held in Atlanta, Georgia. It's December 11th through the 15th. So if you're currently working with Tech 2000, we encourage you to reach out to your sales rep or the person that you have a relationship with there and inquire and ask for more information about this class if this is of interest for you. Having said that, if there are any questions, you can submit them through the portal. And we can also open up the line now, I believe. Casey, is that correct? Can we open up the line for any live questions?
Yeah, we're watching for live questions coming in. We don't have any at this moment, but for those on the call, on the webinar, you have a GoToWebinar panel, which is probably on the right side of your screen. Feel free to drop questions into the questions section of the control panel, and we'll answer them in the order they come in.
While we're waiting for questions, if you guys have any, I did want to share a separate interesting conversation that Julian and I had about like a week or two ago. Unfortunately, one of the things as consumers that we have to deal with is the inappropriate leaking of our personal information out on the internet. And really, we can't take that data back from them. For example, I can't call Equifax and say, please remove all of my personal information from your database. But one of the things that consumers can do is put a credit freeze on their credit record. And that is not the same as monitoring. From a kind of a response point of view, when you're doing credit monitoring, all you're doing is in real time being told when someone has abused your personal information. For example, somebody applied for and got a credit card in your name, somebody applied for a mortgage in your name. With a credit freeze, what you're actually doing is locking your account. So no one can access your account to pull a credit report. They can't apply for credit in your name. And usually when you do a credit freeze, there may be a fee associated with it, but you also associate a PIN. And unless someone calls, proves they're you, and gives the PIN, they're not able to unlock the account and take any kind of action with your credit. It is more work, but for me, it seems at least a little bit more of a direct response to these kinds of breaches.
Yeah, just don't do that if you're in the middle of a mortgage application yourself.
Right.
It could derail things.
Chris, we did have a question come in. I'll go ahead and read it out. Did the Equifax breach and ensuing investigation create a large number of enterprise organizations that rushed to get their internal people trained, or did they tend to look for consulting firms to offload the risk burden to?
I think the answer is yes. I think both, in my experience, both things happen. You're going to see, we've dealt with clients that have had breaches in their past, and what we see a few years later is a much more robust team put in place with very well developed workforce development programs, with incentives for diversifying your security tool set, and a much healthier security culture. Unfortunately, it takes a large event like this to prove the worth of such programs.
Yeah, but that is certainly that's the most telling answer that we can give to this, isn't it? That we interact with we've interacted with some companies and organizations that have suffered very public breaches, and the programs that they have been putting together themselves internally in the wake of that have been significant. So I think that's the most telling sort of telling feature. It's easy to want to just reach for the easy button, right, and say, I'll get a third party to just come in and do this for me. But certainly the most effective way to protect your own infrastructure is to understand it yourselves. But that takes a significantly larger investment.
Second question here. Do you work with organizations to help tailor the training to their specific infrastructure?
We do. We've done that in the past with customers. We teach us to give a sort of the lay of the land. In general, we train in a very tool and vendor agnostic way. The analogy I like to use is that we're not teaching people to find the controls of a particular vehicle. We're teaching them how to drive. And that way, when they get in a different kind of vehicle, they know, oh, I need the thing that does this, and they have to, might need to find the right switch in order to make that thing work. But with that said, yes, we can, and we have tailored training to customers' particular needs. And that can happen on a variety of levels. It could happen, for example, on an infrastructure level. That depends on the platforms. We can't guarantee to train on just any platform because of the scope that might involve for us. But also things like if you consider the world of malware, we've done training for organizations that say, well, we're interested in this particular malware. Can you show us how you would have analyzed this and worked out its capabilities and brought out the indicators needed to feed in those detection systems and things like that.
Yeah, and just to follow on to Julian's comments, going back to his car analogy, what we're after is often to train an analytical mindset. I can give you an example from writing signatures, right? Where we want you to learn how to write and tune and revisit and chain together a series of IDS signatures. Now, that's a principle, right? It's an analytic concept. Whether you then write those signatures in Cisco or any other vendor's IDS, it doesn't matter to us. That's a syntax thing, right? It's the overall concept of how do I make really well-written signatures and how do I tune them and react based on what I see in my network.
Yeah, one more question here. I assume Equifax had a lot of these skills in place, and most large companies do. What separates the companies who get breached from those that don't? Is it just luck?
Oh, that's a good question, but the answer really is there is no separation, right? And what I mean by that is, and this is going back to something Chris alluded to earlier, ultimately any large organization is going to be breached to some extent at some point. That's not a doomsday kind of prophecy or anything. That's one of the mantras I used to use in class a lot, which I'll still hang on to, is the internet is not a warm and fuzzy place, right? It's unfortunately full of people who wish to do harm to others, and so the question is not so much are you going to suffer some kind of breach? We're dealing with very complex systems and networks. And as in the case of the Equifax breach, it's nothing that they did that caused the vulnerability. They were using a library from a third-party source, which turned out to have vulnerabilities in it, and they weren't able to quickly turn around a fix on their own systems. What the difference comes between how quickly you detect that breach. I mean, something that we see actually across the disciplines in which we train is often looking at it from the perspective of like the hacker life cycle. There are various elements that have to occur: reconnaissance of the network, initial breach, securing that access, pivoting and moving through a network, starting to exfiltrate data from the network, perhaps command and control traffic if you've established a presence in various machines and you want to be able to control those implants on those machines. So all of those things have to happen for a successful breach to occur and damage to be, real damage in terms of like this data exfiltration to occur. So the question is, how good are you at detecting that initial breach and stopping it from becoming more severe? And to hark back again just quickly to something else Chris alluded to early on, there are a lot of breaches that do not make the news because they're stopped in their tracks early on, right? And that's the difference right there, I think.
So I think I'd also like to address that. You know, the first part of that question was, did Equifax have the skills? And I think you can, sort of extrapolate that. Do most companies have the skills they need? And I think the answer to that, and I can't speak specifically to Equifax, but in general, the answer to that is a resounding no. Most companies do not have the skill sets in their IT department or in their SOC or in their security department to create an effective defense for breach mitigation. And one of the ways that we know that that's essentially true is that every day in the United States, there are over 1 million open headcount for people with security skill sets. Every day, 1 million open headcount for people with security skill sets. There is a shortage of people with these skill sets. And if you don't have people with the skills, spending money on tools is not going to provide an answer.
Yeah, it was notable as well that in the wake of the breach announcement in September, if you looked, there were actually a number of open security positions for Equifax, which suggests that they were having trouble filling the positions that they had.
Yeah, I found that interesting too.
Got one last question here.
Casey, we're coming up on an hour. Do we have another question?
We've got one more. I'll go ahead and read the question, let the panel answer, and then Chris, you can close us out. So the final question is, what, if any, mandates are being released by government agencies to prevent future Equifax-type breaches and penalize lack of remediation from organizations being breached?
Well, I think that's an interesting one. This case in particular touches on many different existing regulations, right? Regulations regarding personally identifiable information in credit card and other databases, the maintenance of that information, the retention, all the safeguards for its access. But then we have this completely different, interesting aspect of the key stakeholders in that organization selling shares and how that timeline of their selling those shares aligned with the breach and whether that's inside trading. So obviously that pulls in Security Exchange Commission and on the regulations regarding financial transactions within a publicly traded company. So the unfortunate thing is, although we have all these regulations, I can tell you personally, having done vulnerability assessments and presenting results to decision makers, at times they choose to accept risk, and at times it's less expensive to pay the fines associated with not being compliant than it is to actually mitigate the risk. And organizations will make that risk-based decision. They'll say, we're going to go with the least cost here. And it's an unfortunate but true part of business.
Yeah, and we do see companies behaving that way in regards to things like HIPAA compliance, right, which is actually run by the OCR, but addresses data privacy for individuals. We see GDPR coming out of Europe, and that affects many companies in the United States who are actively working in Europe or who are selling goods and services in Europe. We also see the ability of the markets to help address this to some degree, right? And one of the things that we saw earlier in this case with Equifax, and it's really been the case with any of these major breaches, is the class action lawsuits that are following, right? And you might be able to sidestep a fine, and you might be able to make a risk-based decision that says, well, we'll take the hit from a regulatory perspective if we're fined or penalized for that, because it's going to be less expensive than investing in the software. That's probably not going to be the case with something like a class action lawsuit. So I think as the markets start to react, as the legal community starts to react, I think you probably will see regulatory guidance coming from the federal government. We don't have it in place today. We don't know what's on the horizon. But certainly with the release of HIPAA, with the European Union's initiative around GDPR, it's not going to surprise anyone if we see something coming out of the federal government that does address not only data privacy, but really requires companies to be more responsible regarding their position, their plan, and their investment around security and around breach response and breach mitigation. So we're at the top of the hour. I want to thank everybody for your time today. I hope you found this informative, and I hope you found it valuable. We're going to look to pull together another webinar in the not too distant future, so stay tuned for the release on our next webinar and the upcoming topic. If you have any questions, you can reach out to your Tech 2000 rep, or you can continue to reach out to Focal Point. We'll be happy to respond to those via email, or we can set up a call and discuss your questions and your concerns further. Again, thanks everybody for your time, and hopefully we'll see you again real soon.